In dramatic theory, we realize that every story represents a single mind, a story mind, and that the mind's psychology is developed in the story's structure and its personality developed in the storytelling. Well, that model of the mind indicates all of the processes and aspects, the elements of mind, and how they work together. And from that, we developed a theory of psychology that came out of our theory of story. And this psychology theory was called mental relativity because it describes how these different processes of the mind relate one to another. Well, from that, we've divided mental relativity into 4 basic areas: brain, mind, society, and environment. And so in this section, I'd like to discuss a little bit about how mental relativity looks at the brain. Now, Chris and I, we weren't and aren't neurologists. We don't really know that much except as casual investigators of what's going on in the brain, what the physical properties and mechanisms are in the brain. But what we are saying is that the psychology that was developed in stories through thousands of years of storytelling by trial and error in order to communicate from author to audience represent in that medium, that structure that serves as a carrier wave from which content is transmitted from the mind of the author to the mind of the audience or reader in a book, that carrier wave is a platter that serves up the subject matter, serves up the message from author to audience, and it in and of itself, the structure of the story mind, the dynamic structure, is actually a better model of psychology than what you're going to find in a standard book trying to understand what's going on in the head by taking outside observations. Quite by accident, in the process of communication, this beautiful, wonderful, detailed model of the mind was created. Now, once it's created, it's got to have ties into the physiology of the brain, almost in a fractal sense, a dynamic fractal. Not saying that it's physical or the brain is just made of processes. But if the brain exists in such a way that it organizes what goes on in it to create a certain pattern of thought that we all share, the operating systems of all our brains beneath our personal experience, what makes us all human, what makes us able to communicate from one to another, then that underlying mechanism represents patterns that should be found in the physiology of the brain, or at least in the dynamics of the brain generated by the physiology. So almost in a fractal sense, you can take the way these elements of mind work in the model and go look for them in the brain and say, where are those functions represented? And then below that, what creates them? All right. So what follows isn't supposed to necessarily represent the actual physiology of the brain, because we don't know that from a hole in the ground. But it should only be used as a model of the dynamic functions present in the brain. So take this all with a grain of salt, but as a way of getting into looking for a physical investigation of what would create these patterns that mental relativity is predicting we are going to find. So mental relativity is concerned with 2 principal aspects of the brain, the neurology and the biochemistry. Now, it's the contention of the theory that self-awareness is not found in either the neurology nor the biochemistry, but in the relationship between the two, in sort of the conceptual interference pattern between neurology and biochemistry as they have conflicting and interfering influences on the brain itself. Further, each of the 2 different aspects consist of 2 distinct systems each, creating a quad of 4 items, 2 having to do with the neurology and 2 having to do with the biochemistry. Neurology can be divided then into neural networks of the ganglia and the overall neural network that's connecting the different ganglia together and also responding to sensory stimulation. In other words, in the brain are little tiny neural networks called ganglia that contain several thousand tightly interconnected neurons. And in addition, there is a neural network of neurons that contains and carries signals between ganglia, among ganglia, and also carries sensory information. Now, biochemistry can be divided into the localized mix of neurotransmitters in each individual ganglion and the general mix of neurotransmitters in the brain as a whole. In other words, each ganglion has its own microclimate zone of neurotransmitters, that most strongly influences and is influenced by the activity of that particular neural network. In addition, the biochemistry of the brain as a whole reflects the collective influence of the larger network of neurons that connects the ganglia and handles sensory information. So, if this was the extent of it, then the whole system would be kind of binary, and it's insufficient to describe the actual functioning of the mind. In fact, the local biochemistry of each ganglion slowly assimilates into the larger biochemistry of the brain as a whole. In other words, the biochemistry localized inside this neural network of a ganglion will leak out into the brain chemistry. And simultaneously, the brain chemistry of the whole brain influences each ganglion, providing a stabilizing and averaging effect, kind of like a DC offset on which the function of each ganglion biochemically operates. Well, in a like manner, the processing of neural network in each ganglion will have an influence on the information sent between ganglia by the larger network. Whatever happens in these parallel processors, as it were, will then come together and influence what's going on in the larger processor that contains them. Simultaneously, the data flow from the larger network will influence, trigger, and inhibit the operations of a specific ganglion, or mini neural network, micro neural network. As a result of these four kinds of interactions, each of the four aspects of the brain's physiology has a different kind of influence on each of the other three. The whole brain neurology directly influences the whole brain biochemistry and the triggering of neural networks in the ganglia. It indirectly influences the microclimate zone in each ganglion through its effect on the neural network and that's effect on the whole brain biochemistry. The whole brain biochemistry directly influences the whole brain neural networks and the microclimate zone of each ganglion, but it indirectly influences the processing of each ganglion's neural network activity. The neural network of each ganglion directly influences the microclimate zone of the biochemistry in that ganglion and the signals that are sent from that ganglion to the larger whole brain neural network, but it only indirectly influences the biochemistry of the brain as a whole. The microclimate zone, the biochemistry of each ganglion, directly influences the processing of that ganglion's neural network and the biochemistry of the whole brain, but it only indirectly influences the firing of the whole brain neural network. So it's the contention of mental relativity that the four aspects of the brain account for us perceiving the four external dimensions, ultimately, of mass, energy, space, and time. And the four interactions also account for our perceiving four internal dimensions of knowledge, thought, ability, and desire, the equivalence of mass, energy, and space and time when we turn that same dimensional sense inward. Because each of these areas is influenced by the others, neither linear nor nonlinear models can fully describe the mechanism. In fact, a complete model of the mind requires linear, hierarchical, nonlinear, and ultimately relativistic equations. And it's for this reason that this theory of the mind has been named mental relativity. I'm Melanie Ann Phillips. Please join me at dramaticapedia.com for information about the story theory and information about mental relativity.